The cross has been used to perpetrate anti-Judaism, to spread masochism, as in take up your cross and be quiet, and to justify sadism in the name of God. As we approach Easter, a burning question is, why did Jesus die? And why could his death become a symbol of redemption? How could his death be understood other than by perpetuating sadomasochistic identifications with suffering or the spread of suffering? Greetings and welcome to this lecture series on a revolutionary new way of reading the Bible, developed by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books. Drewermann uses insights from psychology, philosophy, poetry, and the sciences to help us read these stories as stories of our own lives. If this is your first time, you can find my previous lectures in a playlist on this channel. If you subscribe, you will get notified of future lectures and other videos on the channel. Now, as we look at the question, why Jesus died and how the cruel event could become a symbol for redemption, Drewermann urges us to approach the question of the meaning of the cross from two different perspectives. On the one hand, from the perspective of Jesus, why did he face the cross rather than hide from it, for instance? And on the other hand, from the perspective of those who find redemption through identifying with his death. And in a certain sense, of those who actually crucified him. Now, today, we will primarily deal with a perspective from Jesus' side. Next week, we will look in depth at why humans killed Jesus and how that then got interpreted as a redemptive dynamic, and what would be redemptive about this horrific event. Drewermann's revolutionary reinterpretation of the cross undoes the sadomasochistic use of the cross and the anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism that has been perpetrated in the name of the cross. We will address both and then go into an understanding why Jesus did not dodge the cross today. So first, against the sadomasochism of the cross. To understand the radical new interpretation of cross and resurrection presented by Drewermann, we need to keep before our eyes the traditional reading of the cross, which is at heart sadomasochistic, meaning it is aggressive from God toward humans, in that God needs a human sacrifice to be satisfied, and then expects humans to be masochistic, in that they have to take the cross upon themselves and give up their aggression toward God, which in traditional Christianity often was interpreted to mean basically to give up yourself completely, to think of yourself as basically nothing, as just a sinner, as depraved. And that basically was used in very masochistic ways. But it is also sadomasochistic in the reverse way. Namely, the God who needs the violent sacrifice is also masochistic, because he and this is all happening, of course, within a patriarchal context. He only needs it because he can find another way of saving us. It pains him, but he is willing to sacrifice his own son to save us. So God is doing this really for us, and also turns against himself in form of his son. And then we humans are also sadistic in that we now have to turn the whole world into little copies of us, hold up the cross on high and convert all humans, fight wars in the name of the cross, crusades to defend the Father God who sacrificed his son. And that we find scapegoats to project our repressed aggression onto them. So that at heart is a sadomasochistic dynamic. And so many people today are saying, this is just cruel. This is not believable anymore. We are not willing to let religion hollow us out from the inside. We are not agreeing with religion being used for masochistic purposes, for mutilating souls, nor are we agreeing to let religion be used for sadistic purposes, to create wars, to vilify groups, and so on. Richard Dawkins, one of the great atheists of our times, has, from his own perspective, analyzed this in form of a God delusion, but he does not really go into the psychological dynamics that are actually going on, and he outright completely dismisses the idea of anything redemptive in the notion of the cross. Now, Drewermann, in contrast to that, and he has also argued with Dawkins in several of his books on science. You can actually see some of these books on religion and science here right behind me. A book on anthropology and the question of God, on biology and the question of God, on cosmology and the question of God, and then neurology didn't fit into one volume. So he ended up writing 2 volumes on neurology and the question of God. They have not been translated yet, but that is something that hopefully one day will be done. But to come back to our lecture for today, the sadomasochism in religion has to be undone by today's interpretations or reinterpretations of the cross and resurrection. If any interpretations perpetuate suffering, whether it's suffering of the self or suffering of others in the name of the cross, then Drewermann argues these interpretations have nothing to do with Jesus, and they have nothing to do with a healing form of Christianity. Now let's go on to the second point that I want to make here at the outset, is against anti-Judaism in the name of the cross. Anti-Judaism in the name of the cross is basically one of the forms of sadism in the name of the cross, and it's one of the earliest forms. So the earliest form of this projection, indeed, of human aggression outward in the sadomasochistic dynamic is anti-Judaism, which is found in the Gospels themselves. It's found in what we call the New Testament, the Christian scriptures itself. I want to take a few moments to emphasize on how Drewermann counters the misuse of the cross to perpetuate violence on people. First, generally, and then I'll go into how it is used in anti-Judaism. So while we see this often in so-called conservative Christian politics or religious leaders around the globe, which scapegoats all kinds of groups of people that do not follow the Christian politicians or religious leaders, for instance, in the demonization of women, of gays and lesbians, of trans folks, of ethnic minorities, of women who have abortions, and so on. The violence perpetrated in the name of the cross against Jews throughout history is one of the clearest and most cruel examples of how what Drewermann calls an externalistic historical interpretation of the cross that can create horrific suffering. Drewermann's depth psychological interpretation of the story of cross and resurrection provides us indeed with a powerful tool to counter the anti-Judaism that has characterized Christianity from its inception in the Christian scriptures we call the New Testament. And I actually, a couple of years ago, I published an article called Countering Anti-Semitism in Religion that you can find online. It is basically a way of applying Drewermann's analysis to the whole discussion about whether monotheism, the belief in one God, automatically leads to violence and a response to the anti-Judaism that often was done in response to the Jewish belief of one God. So you can look that up. It's in the journal, the Psychoanalytic Review. I have summarized in my book, A Violent God Image, Drewermann's countering of anti-Judaism in the name of Christianity. And this is the book in which you can find this, A Violent God Image. It was published in 2004 and 2006. It was reissued as a paperback it's currently by Bloomsbury Publishing, and you can get it in anywhere books are sold. So on page 228 on this book and the following pages, Drewermann makes the point that when the Gospels talk about certain groups, be it the Pharisees or the scribes or the Sadducees or the Romans, that we today have to read these references to groups not as descriptions of accurate historical portrayals, but rather as types of attitudes that exist in all forms of religions and societies throughout time, and that these are in fact universal attitudes, attitudes found among all humans. And Drewermann argues that the only way we can overcome the anti-Judaism of these texts is if we stop reading them as historical accounts that blame certain groups in the past, and instead we should look where in ourselves today we find these attitudes described. So it's very much like reading these texts more like that these are characters that represent attitudes in us, parts in us. Drewermann argues in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, which he wrote later in the 1990s, that we should therefore place quotation marks around these groups whenever they're mentioned in the Gospels and whenever we speak about them. He goes so far to say, and this is in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, quote, the word Pharisees, and he puts it in quotation marks, however, has to be set in quotation marks from now on, if not eliminated altogether as too misleading. From here on, the word describes, in the language of the evangelist, not a group of historical Judaism, but a type of piety within the church and within ourselves. The reason for this is because, and actually I will go into this as we continue here, I will read a portion of my summary in A Violent God Image of Drewermann's way to counter anti-Judaism by means of a depth psychological method of interpretation now. And this is found in pages 228 and 229. So here's what I write, first a summary, and then I will quote a lengthy citation, cite a lengthy quotation from Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark. So here's how I summarize it. Drewermann notes, however, that historical critical studies, that is the historical research of biblical texts, have clearly shown that the negative role which Mark has the Pharisees especially play is not accurate in terms of external facts, but is rather a projection back into Jesus' time of the tensions between the early church and Judaism after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70, our current era. Historical criticism is indispensable to Drewermann as a tool for dismantling inaccurate external historical notions in religious texts. It is precisely this external historical inaccuracy in Mark and in the other Gospels which has contributed tremendously to an anti-Jewish ideology. This is a quote from Drewermann himself, in the midst of Christianity. But this was possible only because, Drewermann argues, Christianity has tended to identify history with external facts. So here now you can see why method matters. Whether we read these texts just as historical texts, or whether we read them by means of depth psychology as texts that are about our human experience today, has tremendous significance. It can literally decide over life or death. If Christian theology, so this tendency to identify history with external facts also characterizes historical criticism itself, the method of historical criticism itself. If Christian theology retains this historical perspective, it may shift the blame from Pharisees to Sadducees or to the Romans, but it will still, at least latently, remain trapped in the attitude of blaming some historical group in the past for the fate of Jesus. Against this external understanding of history, which really Drewermann thinks is a misunderstanding, Drewermann sets a depth psychologically informed typological reading of the Gospels, which he argues is alone able to avoid vilifying whole groups of people as historical enemies of Christ. In a typological reading of the groups, which Mark portrays as religious enemies of Jesus, they are understood not as external historical groups, but as symbols for a type of religious attitude which is in danger, and this is a quote from Drewermann, in all religion, in all nations and all religions, Christianity itself is no exception, where external direction by power and external obedience are valued higher than the power of personal experience and inner conviction. It is of utmost, and this, there ends the quote, is of utmost importance to see, quote, that from a theological perspective, the Gospel of Mark is not concerned with certain groups of ancient Judaism, not at all with the history of a certain people at a certain time, unquote, and to see the reaction he portrays, meaning Mark, of the Jews and the Romans to Jesus, quote, rather as an expression of our own being, unquote. This is found on pages 56 and 57 of Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark, the first volume, which I am in the process of translating, and which this lecture series here supports. Now I'll continue my summary of what Drewermann says about this topic, while clarifying his case for a typological reading of the Gospels. Drewermann points out the devastating effects which a historicizing, externalistic interpretation of religious texts had in theological education during the Third Reich, and must have as long as theology refuses to adopt a typological, symbolic, inner way of interpretation. And so in the Gospel of Mark, in the commentary of the Gospel of Mark, on page 57, Drewermann presents this correction. He writes, if one wants to avoid a relapse into anti-Jewish ideology, namely in Christianity, which undoubtedly exists and has existed, it is indeed decisive to understand and interpret the seemingly historical stories of the Gospels in their typological content, valid for all times. Not historical groups, but existential attitudes make up what is Pharisaic and always deadly that opposes the message of Jesus. It is true, if one reads the New Testament historically instead of typologically, externally instead of internally, sociologically instead of psychologically, one cannot avoid doing theology as ideology. Any external understanding of religion is violent and provokes violence. Recall when the word Jews was spoken in the lecture hall of the Theological Academy in Paderborn 45 years ago. And this is then basically in the 1940s, and Drewermann was teaching at the Theological Academy in Paderborn in the 1980s when he wrote the commentary on the Gospel of Mark. He was not a full professor, but an adjunct professor, basically. And he is now talking about here how this anti-Jewish ideology that stemmed from the method of interpretation showed up in the lecture halls during the Third Reich. So when the word Jews was spoken in the lecture hall of the Theological Academy in Paderborn 45 years ago. During an exegetical lecture on the Gospel of John, the candidates for priesthood, meaning the students, hissed and pawed dutifully in order to give expression to their theological abhorrence of the people of Jesus murderers, this worst anti-Jewish stereotype. So this was happening in theological academies in Germany during the Third Reich, and this fueled the anti-Semitism and the anti-Judaism that basically made the Holocaust possible. This kind of theology is underpinning what happened in the Third Reich. And as we know, the so-called German Christians and the masses of German Christians were all influenced by this form of theologizing, this form of historicizing, this form of blaming historical groups in the past for Jesus' death. This horrific form of theology is what Drewermann is trying to undo by means of his depth psychological method of interpretation. So his typological reading of these texts is countering this form of anti-Semitism. Now, Drewermann continues, to a certain degree, it is of course useful to show by means of historical criticism how the image of Judaism becomes systematically falsified, particularly in the Gospel of John. So there is value to historical criticism. One should not misunderstand Drewermann as being against it, but it has to look at its own shadow that comes from reducing interpretation basically to historicizing. Drewermann continues, but it is much more important to comprehend that the battle between the realm of light and the realm of darkness, as John portrays it, runs thematically throughout all of human existence and cannot be relativized historically, politically, sociologically, racially, etc. Here ends the quote from Drewermann's commentary on the Gospel of Mark about how to counter the methodological problem that led to anti-Jewish interpretations of cross and resurrection. So we need to keep this typological reading of references to certain groups in the text in mind as we now listen to how Drewermann undoes the harmful misuse of the cross to inflict suffering on self and other. And so in my book, A Violent God Image, on pages 220 to 226, I have translated Drewermann's description and refutation of the traditional interpretation of this harmful understanding of the cross as follows. It is under the title, The Cross of Salvation, in Drewermann's second volume of the Gospel of Mark. And so he titled that section, The Cross of Salvation, or Against Masochism of Religion. The text reads like this. Why is the cross a sign of salvation? In the liturgy of Good Friday, namely of the Roman Catholic Church, in which he was a priest at the time he wrote this book, the Church calls upon believers to step toward the cross and kiss it. But is there even one among us who loves to suffer? Jesus did not want to. He was terribly afraid of being tormented and tortured. He loved life, not suffering. In the spirit of Jesus, no slogan could be more unchristian than this one, that one has to love suffering in the name of Christ. It is Christian to fight as much as possible suffering, sickness, and insanity. It is Christian to commit oneself to life and the possibility of living of each individual, not to preach suffering or to sanctify masochism. Otherwise, Jesus would indeed have died in vain. Death and the negation of life would, as always, have the last word. This must be said because no day of the ecclesiastical year, meaning of the church year, has and is supposed to have as abiding an effect on our hearts as Good Friday. Often enough in this sense, that God has loved us infinitely, but that we are sinners and murderers, that God's Son died for us on the cross, but that we shy away from suffering and try to avoid sacrifice, that Christ has given himself for us and took the path of service, but that we are egoists who want to be in control and want to realize ourselves. If these opposites were accurate, then the cross would indeed be nothing more than a signal of holy suicide and an embodiment of fatal self-reproaches and self-accusations. It would not redeem us, but kill us by perpetuating, simply by other means, what Jesus fought against most passionately. A kind of religion, or a type of religion, which consists only of fear and guilt feelings, and which amounts to a sadistic form of obsessional neurosis, which demands again and again that one has to kill. Animals have to be slaughtered as sacrifices, drives have to be suppressed as impure, feelings must be controlled as dangerous, and thoughts must be avoided as too selfish. The instruments ready and appropriate for the killing would already be at hand. Commandments, laws, regulations, and institutions, together with a huge heap of taboos, thought inhibitions, and punishments. Every religion not only binds, but also generates fear. And one cannot see that Christianity is a priori immune against being just as hostile to humans as any other religion which has become ossified in loyalism and moralism. The fact that the early church, with reference to the teaching and practice of Jesus, summoned the courage to untie itself from the bonds of laws in favor of a deeper humanity does not yet prove that Christianity itself has really become better, that is, more humane after 2,000 years. We do not even have to recall here the pyres of the Inquisition erected due to fear of the freedom of thought of humans. We do not need to recall the witch trials led due to fear of women and disgust with one's own sexuality. Always justified, we note, with the sign of the cross and with this necessity of the discipleship of suffering of Christ. It is enough to observe in the present how, in the name of Christianity, especially the best and the most pious feel urged to engage in constant self-distrust, and self-suppression. The cross means for them that they constantly have to flee from themselves, that they, if possible, do not need to perceive themselves in their deeper feelings, but instead they take care of others, always with a well-worn mask of a Christian smile and a jumble of religious phrases on their lips. Indeed, industriously and with a tremendous degree of goodwill, and yet, in truth, inhumanely and cruelly. We Christians first have to take a good look at the monstrous fact that a genius such as Sigmund Freud could, in view of his patients, reach no other conclusion than that religion on the whole represents a singular crucifixion of the human being, a grand neurotic show, a suppression of everything which wants to live humanly. One may object that these ideas do not belong to the topic of Good Friday and to the texts of the crucifixion of Jesus. What else, however, would be the topic of Good Friday, if not the barbarism and the inhumanity especially associated with religion? Hence, one must ask, where in the church can one actually speak of the true miseries of humans without immediately coming up against the whole apparatus of rules which have already been decided in advance and which formulate and declare without any hesitation what has to count as Christian or Catholic and whatnot? Or to ask even more specifically, where among the clergy, among the scribes and high priests of today, does one meet people who would not be brimful of all sorts of unfreedom, of cruel fears from childhood, and of a whole ensemble of fearfully internalized prejudices, which were later declared as sacrosanct? Here you saw how Drewermann uses the terms of these groups in the gospel as symbolic for attitudes in the clergy. But they're in all of us potentially. To continue, one thing seems clear. If one wants the mass, large numbers, one needs institutions and ordinances. One needs obedient colonies of humans. But if one wants the human being, one must value the individual infinitely higher than the mass. One must, as Jesus, be absolutely more concerned with the 100th sheep than with the other 99. But the decisive issue is now, if one only brings into this world of regulated fears even a single spark of confidence and freedom, namely in the individual, the hunt is on immediately. Immediately one fears chaos. Immediately one resists them, meaning confidence and freedom, as if they were the devil incarnate. One has to understand this paradox in order to understand why Jesus had to die. But one has to stop the habit of humiliating people in the name of God with reference to the cross of Christ and destroying them through guilt feelings. One has to stop nailing people to the cross in the name of the cross and calling this travesty of religion discipleship of Christ. If we understood the message of Jesus in an interpretation so hostile to humanity, then we would be not a bit different from, and here again comes the typological interpretation of the groups, then we would not be a bit different from Annas, Caiaphas, Herod, and Pilate as portrayed in the Gospels. If Jesus had wanted that, then one would without doubt have to depict blasphemily a God who feeds on the suffering of humans. And here Drewermann points to an example of a religion in which religious rules were used to kill, which again represents something inside us as a possibility. So blasphemily depict blasphemily a God who feeds on the suffering of humans and who, as the sun god, the son of the Aztecs, only lives by devouring daily hecatombs of slaughtered children and young men. So this rigidity of religion that can sacrifice people in the name of God, that can sacrifice the life of people, that can bog people down, is found in all religions. And these types of people or of groups that are listed in the gospel have to be understood typological as something in us or in our current day as well, and types of religiosity that we should counter in nonviolent ways through psychological interpretation. And here's how Drewermann does some of this. Against the pietistic perversion of the cross into an ideology of the mysticism of suffering, one cannot forcefully enough repeat, Jesus did not want to die on the cross. And he never thought to declare inhumanity and torture to be signs of true trust into God. To the contrary, he lived so that humans would receive back their dignity as creatures of God, so that they would regain their innocence and uninhibitedness in relation to God, and so that the unceasing suffering which afflicts humans because of God, as portrayed in the religions of human history, would find an end. All the signs and miracles of Jesus transmitted to us speak for this attitude. In closeness to Jesus, it happened again and again that people who were crippled their whole life were able to stand up through their trust in God, that through his words they would receive back their senses, and that they would again be able to see the world as it is. In response to his word, they learned again to trust their own ears, their own judgment, and their own thinking. It did not pose a contradiction for Jesus, but was one and the same thing: to find God and to find oneself. Both happened for him, for Jesus, through the power of one and the same trust. and the one was for him only the sign for the other. Precisely for that reason, people who understood him called him the life, because he spoke to them and allowed them, because what he spoke allowed them to live and brought them to life. Exactly for that reason, they called him the way, because thus they found direction and perspective in their life. Exactly for that reason, they called him the truth, because through him, their life and all things around them found again their true gestalt, because they could live in him as they were actually meant to and created to. They called him the Son of God. And they killed him, crucified him, simply because he allowed them to live humanly? Yes, only for that and no other reason. Only those who had nothing at all to lose could follow him without fear. All others began at some point to resist his plain truth and to defend their inhumanities. This whole world and every human being in it consists in reality only of fear. Everyone tries in her own manner to defend against her nothingness. And those who succeed most are in the end worst off. Nothing is as difficult as to remain human, true, and kind in the face of fear, and not to escape into power, lies, and destruction. But this is what Jesus wanted to say, and what his whole life was about. That from the perspective of God, we could defeat fear and would be able to live as free humans. Really, only for that reason did he have to die. And precisely for that reason can the cross, this cursed stigma, this monstrous embodiment of all human torture, become, despite everything, a sign of salvation. If one brings into this world a little kindness and compassion in the spirit of Jesus, if one goes so far as to slightly transcend with it the narrow sphere of nurse and Red Cross morality, of course, nothing against nurses or the Red Cross here. It's about how to go beyond that here. If one engages beyond the charitable care of symptoms, the structural background and origins of our dilemma, then one soon will experience how little such an effort fits into this world, and soon will begin to encounter the intentional distortions, the setting up of traps, the know-all attitude, and above all, the recourse to how things have always been and are certainly written down somewhere. Due to fear, everyone has an interest to lie to himself and to hide himself, so that he has to kill the one who tells him the truth. Humans kill Jesus not because they would be as such against God, not because they would naturally be egoists, not because they would principally not want to suffer, but because due to fear, not a single one has the courage to simply be a human being. Therefore, it is decisive for Jesus to show himself and us that what he believes is true, that it is possible to overcome fear through trust in God, and to stay loyal to the truth of one's own existence. At this moment, when everything is at stake, words and miracles are no longer useful. At the end of the story of suffering in Mark, Jesus no longer makes a single comment. Instead, all that counts at this hour is to do the decisive deed, which the Gospel of John mentions so often, and which is the only possible and valid way that can attest to all that has been said and done, by risking one's own life through death. Therefore, the all-decisive question to us is, to what extent do we accept the death of Jesus as this attestation? If we do, then salvation indeed comes from the cross. In itself, the cross is the sign of the most abominable and the most base which we humans can do to each other. But if even the cross loses its power to instill fear, then we could finally and truly begin to live as humans. Then nothing would exist from which we would have to escape. So I want to stress here and pause for a moment that what Drewermann is arguing is that the cross is not significant because of the suffering that it represents, but the exact opposite, because it symbolizes that Jesus did not give into the fear that the group think wants us to give into. It's the end of the scapegoating. And here I want to do a little aside, because in his book on the scapegoat, the famous scholar René Girard also provides an idea that the scapegoating mechanism was interrupted through the cross. Sandra Schneiders, the former president of the Catholic Biblical Association, wrote an article on the Gospel of John that basically echoes Drewermann's interpretation here, and she draws both on Drewermann's interpretation as found and portrayed in my book, A Violent God Image, and on René Girard's interpretation, René Girard thinks that we kill each other because of a mechanism called mimesis, that basically we can't stand that someone else is like us. That's a very simplified version. Drewermann addresses something similar in his interpretation on the Cain and Abel story, which he describes in the Gospel of Mark commentary, but which he first really analyzed in depth in his first major work, the 3-volume work that we have here, Strukturen des Bösen, Structures on Evil. And there Drewermann provides a different interpretation of the Cain and Abel story than René Girard. And I think this might be of interest, at least to some scholars, but also makes an important point. So hang on if this does not interest you as a person who is not into the kind of scholarship stuff, but some important things are coming toward the end of this lecture. But I want to make this point here that Drewermann argues that the Cain and Abel story basically portrays how when we are caught up in what he calls a spell of anxiety or spell of fear in the face of realizing that death is inevitable, that when that happens, then we try to take anything in the world to calm this anxiety. And that is how he interprets, for instance, the so-called false story, where the eating of the fruit is an attempt to take something in the world that is finite to address an infinite and absolute problem. And that never works. And now fear then gets basically spiraled up. It spirals up. And in this world of fear, the other appears as the competitor. So this is not an automatic human mechanism as René Girard portrays it. Rather, it is only a mechanism that really appears when we are caught up in the spell of fear or the spiral of fear. Then the other becomes an absolute competitor for the absolute love of God as we imagine it. And then people think that if they sacrifice the best of themselves, then they would be able to get God's favor. That's what happens in the story of Cain and Abel. And what Drewermann points out there is that even the God that's portrayed in that story cannot stop Cain with moral injunctions. Instead, Cain is basically overpowered by these suppressed feelings of rage, and really ultimately the desire to be loved unconditionally, to be seen as wonderful, to be valued in himself. And he thinks that Abel is the ultimate competitor for that. Drewermann believes that this is actually the spiritual source, basically, of all wars. That we try to address fears of death that are very deep down, and then we are seeing the other as the one that competes for our space, which is really our existential space, our desire to be. But I'll end here and I'll go back into finishing Drewermann's interpretation in this particular text. So I was saying, but if even the cross loses its power to instill fear, then we could finally and truly begin to live as humans. Then nothing would exist from which we would have to escape, meaning then we could also end our fear. We're moving towards the end of Drewermann's interpretation here. Often it is said that a human being needs another human being to believe. True, but all human fear consists precisely in the inability to believe any human anymore. Beyond the fear of all humans, we have only this single example of Jesus. If we believe him as to his death, then the world changes entirely. Then those who mocked him, again, this is a type of attitude, the high priests, the soldiers, and the man hanged with him. Anyone, any character in this story who does this mocking there is also a type, a representation in us. So then those who mocked him are once and for all made wrong by the brutal logic of their impotent power and by the very limited truth of their coercive, anxiety-ridden obedience. Against the possibility for humanity, then, no objection exists any longer, which in principle could not be weathered and borne in view of the cross of Jesus. Then all of his words of the dignity of even the least human being, of the power of trust, and of the opportunity for kindness are irrefutably true because he didn't give in and sold them out. But if we cannot even put our faith in the death of Jesus, then indeed the earth is now shaken to its core and the sun is darkened, as in Mark 15:33 or Matthew 27:45 and 51. And we remain unredeemably what we have always been, inhumans of pure fear, living dead without resurrection. No God can do more in order to take the fear away from us than to die for us in this cruel way as a human being. And here ends the reading of this text, but I want to say here that this last sentence is not to be understood in a sadomasochistic fashion. Rather, as I say in the second chapter of my book, A Violent God Image, where I portray Drewermann's interpretation of the so-called Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, that this symbol of eating the Godhead, as we do in the Lord's Supper, in the Last Supper, the Holy Meal, however one may call it, is actually a form of expressing the aggression that we have unto God, who is the only one who can take it without actually dying. That is the heart of the message of the resurrection. I just want to point this out here at the beginning. I want to leave it here because next week we will go further into this dynamic. I want to again summarize Drewermann's implications for the interpretation of the cross. Any suffering that is inflicted on individuals or groups in the name of Jesus or the cross is in explicit contradiction to the very heart of the message of Jesus. Next week, we will hear why his message eventually met with such deadly opposition from people, and what it is even in us that opposes this radically loving message. We might think, oh no, we are all for love. But Drewermann goes into depth that we are often not aware of, why we might actually resist what would be good for us. So We will read the cross from the perspective of what is happening in us, in people, in us, or in people, meaning both people and us, who kill what would let them live. If you have enjoyed this lecture, feel free to share it. Feel free to look at the playlist with the other lectures. I invite you to subscribe to this channel and also to tune in again next Saturday. We will have a lecture next Saturday, and then we'll take a break for the week of Easter. I wish you a good week this week, good weekend, and I will see you next week. Thank you for joining me. Goodbye now.